So my name is Aliyah Fraser. I'm a second year student athlete at St. FX and creator of the St. FX BVA. So the St. FX BVA is the St. FX BIPOC Varsity Association. And if you don't know what BIPOC means, it means Black, Indigenous, and Persons of Color. The BIPOC Varsity Association aims to really empower athletes of color and connect them with the community. So currently I'm surveying student athletes on St. FX's campus who are visible minorities and who are not, and comparing their student experience on our campus climate. So this is really interesting for me because athletes who identify as BIPOC often have a different student experience than athletes who are not BIPOC, who make up the majority of St. FX's campus. So within my survey, we asked specific questions such as, do you feel St. FX celebrates your heritage? Or do you feel supported by your coaching staff and your teammates? And these answers were really interesting because everyone kind of answered differently based on what group they identified as. But we found that the majority of BIPOC athletes did not necessarily feel like they fit in or were celebrated on campus, where the majority of other athletes did. So again, with my survey, some of the other questions were pretty specific to athletes, which is why we only surveyed athletes. But one of the questions that really struck me was the question, do you feel St. FX views you as an athlete first rather than a student? And the response to this question was really striking because I expected the majority of BIPOC athletes to say, yeah, like I feel like I'm viewed as an athlete rather than a student first, and the other majority part of athletes to say they didn't feel like they were an athlete first. But it was super surprising because like 89% of all student athletes felt they were viewed as athletes first rather than students, which kind of says a lot about being an athlete and that student experience in itself. So currently it's Black History Month, which is the month of February, which is super important for the BVA because it gives us an excuse kind of to be more visible on campus and in the community. So some of the initiatives we've been doing for Black History Month is we purchased a ton of books for kids in the Antigonish Elementary, Middle, and High School, and another rural school. And it's really important that we purchase these books because the schools in themselves only have a very, very, very small population of BIPOC students. So the books we chose really empower those students and tell them it's okay to be different, and they just really celebrate diversity. We're handing out the books to those kids and reading to them just to kind of empower them and show them that they have role models like them within the community. So the books we chose for the high school were the Book of Negros by Lawrence Hill, which is really interesting because not only is it kind of like a really good book to kind of empower those students, but it talks about the history of the Nova Scotia slave trade and all that history that kind of does not get taught in schools. So we thought that was really important to give to high school students. Also for Black History Month, we purchased a ton of posters to put up in the St. FX Student Union building that really celebrate diversity, and they have a bunch of facts on them. So those will be seen around campus. And the big thing we did for Black History Month is the Black History Dinner, which is the first dinner of its kind on St. FX campus. And it's super important to us because it's allowing other students to kind of have a taste of culture that they might not have experienced before, but then it allows students who identify as BIPOC to feel celebrated and have food that they might not have been able to have since they've been on campus. So one of the biggest influences who inspired me to apply for the Racial Justice Leadership Grant is Coach Liana Osei, who is my head coach of the women's basketball team. And at the time of the grant, the climate of the world was really crazy. It was just after the George Floyd incident happened, and there was just a ton of just crazy stuff going on. And I knew I had to do something bigger than myself because I knew in this time it's very, very, very important. And she really pushed me to do so. So we sat down and we discussed what was missing kind of at St. FX and how that would impact me and my immediate circle and how I could kind of work with what I have. So we decided it would be a great idea to start a BVA on St. FX's campus, which is similar to one at U of T created by a super awesome girl named Mahal. And then we just kind of ran with it. We thought because the BVA was one of the first organizations of its kind on St. FX's campus that in year one it would just be kind of like free-flowing. We see it out, we do initiatives on campus and survey athletes to see what they really need. And the surveying part is very, very, very important because currently St. FX does not have any race-based data on their students as a collective or their athletes. So we decided to start small and just survey athletes to understand their experiences on St. FX's campus and how they feel in our campus climate. So that's really interesting for me specifically because St. FX is kind of in a rural area of Nova Scotia, which is predominantly white. And myself being from another rural area in Nova Scotia that's predominantly white, I was often the only minority in my school or in my class or on my team. And that experience in itself really shaped who I am today. So I thought it'd be very interesting to survey athletes on St. FX's campus, as a lot of times they might be the only BIPOC person in their class or might be the only person on their team, and they'll have a different experience than other student athletes. So for the St. FX BIPOC Varsity Association, I can definitely see it becoming a really big part of St. FX athletics, as a lot of the athletes St. FX would like to recruit or current athletes fall into the BIPOC category. And having an organization like the BVA is super important for those athletes to feel represented and feel important and included on St. FX's campus. And I'd really like to pass the torch on to those upcoming in St. FX athletics and keep the tradition going so athletes can feel empowered and represented within athletics.
So thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We just have a couple questions we'd like to ask. So what inspired you to choose this topic for your project?
So being a BIPOC athlete at St. FX, I often feel like I'm not represented in a lot of decisions that are made, or things that specifically impact me aren't really taken into account because I'm a minority on campus and specifically in athletics. So it just really inspired me kind of feeling like an outcast in a community that I definitely should not feel like an outcast in, and knowing that there's other athletes going through the same thing as myself who don't necessarily have a voice really inspired me.
What was the most challenging part of developing this project, and on the flip side, what was the most rewarding?
The most challenging part, I would definitely have to say, is recruiting members and kind of figuring out what we wanted to do, because U of T already had a BVA, but we didn't necessarily want to be what they were. We wanted to be our own BVA. So kind of finding our own identity within the St. FX community was challenging at first, but it's super rewarding now to see the fruits of our labor coming through, specifically with the Black History Dinner and our community engagement initiatives.
So why do you think it's so important to have conversations about race and racism in sports specifically?
It's super important to have conversations specifically about race and racism in sports, because across all sports there's a ton of BIPOC athletes competing, and those athletes might not feel comfortable in spaces on their teams. So educating teams and coaches and each other is super important as we keep the conversation going, because some people might not be familiar with things that are racist, but to them they might not be because they're just accustomed to them. And just really making everyone feel comfortable and creating an inclusive environment is super important.
Why do you think that Black student athletes feel as though they're viewed as athletes first and students second?
I feel like Black students are definitely viewed as athletes before students just because of racial stereotypes that have been going on for generations. You know, the stereotypical Black athlete doesn't care about school, just wants to go pro, is only here for a short amount of time, and that's definitely untrue of the BIPOC community. So I feel like those stereotypes and prejudices that some professors might have definitely reflects on Black students. For example, there was an alumni that I was on a panel with of St. FX a few days ago, and he was talking about his student experience at St. FX with his previous coach, and he had a pretty challenging year in his first year. He was acting out and he wasn't doing well in school, and he got a scholarship. He had probably a 65 average, but he remembers in his exit meeting with his coach telling him, "You had a great year," and he's like, "I got suspended for fighting 3 times. I'm barely passing my classes. Like, I was just able to get my scholarship." And the coach said, "I have a great year." And that's the moment he realized that he was only as good to his coach as long as he was useful. And just kind of that story really hit me, because I know that hits home with a lot of current St. FX athletes, and just to be able to prevent that and kind of get rid of those stereotypes is super important.
What do you hope the legacy of this project will be for the St. FX sporting community and the wider university sporting community?
I hope the legacy my project has really gives those BIPOC athletes a voice and celebrates their heritage, because they put in so many hours on the field or on the court or on the ice, and just to have a voice and feel accepted for who you are is super, super important. And I think it's really important that we connect with the St. FX community and Antigonish community for the next generation, because there's a ton of BIPOC kids within that community who don't have anyone to look up to who looks like them. So just having those role models on the St. FX BVA is super important.
So where do you see yourself in 10 years?
So in 10 years, I see myself in med school because I want to be a family physician, specifically in the Black community, because that's a whole other issue. But Black men and women often have adverse experiences within healthcare, and having more BIPOC doctors can hopefully combat those issues. So I definitely see myself in med school, hopefully still working on projects like this and engaging with the St. FX BVA as an alumni, and just empowering kids to really tell them it's okay to be BIPOC, it's okay to be you, celebrate who you are, and yeah.
Where can people find you and how can they get involved in your project?
So people can find me on Instagram at St. FX BVA. They can also contact me on the About Us section of the website or through Instagram DMs.
Thank you so much for your time. We look forward to hearing more about your project.